The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this IT Governance USA webinar on how to conduct a risk assessment. I'm Alan Calder. I'm your host for this evening, and we've got about an hour together. My background is in general management. I set up IT Governance about 12 or 13 years ago in order to create a one-stop shop for organizations that were tackling governance, data protection, cybersecurity, and similar subjects, recognizing that for an organization to make any real progress with what's now called cybersecurity, the board would have to be involved, the C-suite would have to be involved, and so I called the book that I wrote about implementing information security IT Governance, an international guide to data security. It became a university textbook. It's now in its 6th edition, and it gave rise to this business, IT Governance, which is now a substantial UK business, growing very quickly across the whole of the European Union, with offices in Ireland, Belgium, Amsterdam, and consultants through another half dozen member states, and with an office in New York. IT Governance USA Inc. is our US subsidiary business, and we're growing very quickly in the US as well. So we've got about an hour tonight. I'm going to be talking not about IT governance, the business, where cyber resilience, data protection, GDPR are really at the heart of what we do, but I'm going to be talking much more about information security. And I'm going to be talking about the difference between information security and cybersecurity very briefly. Not that I think it's terribly important, but it is a subject which comes up quite often. I'm going to be talking for about 45 or 50 minutes. And if you find that you have questions that you want to ask through the duration of this webinar, please use the question function in the GoToWebinar screen. You can type in any question that you've got that arises out of the subject matter that I'm talking about. And then when we come to the end of the formal outward bound session, I'll pick up any questions that there are. I'll read the question out to everybody in the audience so that you know what the question is, and then I will answer it. So do feel free that if you've got questions, you make sure that you do ask them. So today we're going to talk about information security and cybersecurity, what an effective information security risk management and risk assessment process looks like, how to conduct a risk assessment. There are 5 steps we've identified that are fundamental to doing a risk assessment effectively, how to choose appropriate risk treatment options, the key controls necessary for effective cybersecurity, and then the business of reviewing, monitoring, and reporting on the risk assessment. We've now helped probably 600 odd companies achieve ISO 27001 certification. We've helped several thousand organizations with documentation toolkit. We've had many more than that undergo our lead implementer, lead auditor training courses. So we've built up a very solid understanding of what's effective, what works in terms of an ISO 27001 information security management system, and in terms of what works in relation to the risk assessment, which is right at the heart of ISO 27001. And it's that experience really that I'm going to be drawing on through this afternoon. So today's newspapers are full of cybersecurity. They're also full of data protection, particularly with the news out today and yesterday that Facebook is in some trouble for allowing another company to harvest some 50 million individual user data from Facebook pages. There are likely, as the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation comes into force for data controllers in the European Union and those in the United States providing services into the European Union, to be many more such instances. And the heart of GDPR, part of course, is protecting personal data, but really it's another way of thinking about cybersecurity, of thinking about the steps that an organization needs to take in order to protect the data of both the people whose data it's processing, but also more broadly the corporate information, financial data, intellectual property, and so on of an organization. We've always talked about information security, and the definition on the right-hand side of your screen is the traditional definition of information security, which is really the protection of the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or the CIA, of information. And traditionally, this definition of information includes both analog and digital data. It includes the physical facilities and hardware within which information is processed. So it's a very broad definition, and it's appropriate when you think about the different ways in which the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information can be compromised. It's not just in cyberspace, but also through physical intrusion, through physical disruption. Cybersecurity is usually seen as a component or a subsector of information security. It's typically the technologies, processes, and measures designed to protect individuals and organizations from cybercrime. To my way of thinking, I have to say, while cybersecurity to a purist is really about digital data and protecting that data from digital threats, the reality is that digital data is just as prone to be compromised through a physical attack, a social media attack in terms of somebody bluffing their way into an organization, somebody being able to install a USB stick or a keylogger into a physical box. Compromises of physical security are just as likely to lead to compromises of digital data as are cyber attacks. So I think there's a practical approach which says cybersecurity, information security, doesn't matter what you call it, as long as the definition is sufficient to get the organization to commit a big enough budget for you to be able to take appropriate steps to protect information of all sorts against the attacks of all sorts which can be made. And remember also, we're not just talking about attacks, we're talking about accidental compromises, we're talking about natural disasters and natural events, all of which can compromise data and compromise the ability of the organization to operate effectively. You may already be familiar with ISO 27001. ISO IEC 27001 is an international standard, sets out a specification for an information security management system. A specification is a set of clearly stated requirements, and because there are requirements, you can carry out an audit of an organization against a set of requirements. You can't audit an organization against good practice, and the ISO 27002 guidance on implementing controls is good practice. It's guidance, and so it has words like implement in the way that you see fit, if indeed you see fit. You can't audit somebody against a requirement which doesn't exist. So ISO 27001 is a specification against which an audit can be carried out. And an ISMS, an information security management system, in accordance with ISO 27001, is something which will have been put together in line with the current global best practice for an information security management system. ISO standards are put together by national bodies working internationally, collaboratively to generate an international standard which is recognized and applied in exactly the same way in every single country of the world. ISO 27001 has the same words, the same specification in the United States as it does in Britain, France, or Germany. The translation into other languages doesn't change the specification. ISO 27001 is a standard that deals with people, process, and technology. Those are the three legs, if you like, of the ISMS stool, in the same way that confidentiality, integrity, and availability are the three legs of information security. So people, process, and technology, you need to address in a way that between them give you a well-balanced ISMS. And at the heart of being able to do that is a risk assessment, assessing and managing risk to information. And that risk assessment is the heart of ISO 27001. ISO 27001 in practical terms, therefore, doesn't say here is a set of controls you have to implement. It says here is a management system within which you need to carry out a risk assessment, and on the basis of which you should select a number of controls. And whatever those controls are that you select, you should make sure that they help you achieve your business objectives, and that the selection should be based on a objective expression of management's acceptance of risk to the organization's assets. In other words, recognizing that some businesses have a greater appetite for risk than do others. A large organization operating in the financial sector, where a cybersecurity attack might disrupt the delivery of banking services to millions of people, is likely to have a much more conservative approach to risk than a small startup fintech organization where the number of customers it's serving is relatively small and it's very agile and can move on from a major disruption fairly quickly. So attitude to risk, the organization's level of risk acceptance is fundamental to the risk assessment itself, which is fundamental to the ISMS. And any good, robust cybersecurity program should incorporate the establishment and maintenance of an ISMS, because an ISMS is all-encompassing. It deals with the physical environment within which data is processed. ISO 27005 is an international standard for carrying out risk assessments. Not surprisingly, it's designed to operate in the context of ISO 27001. So why conduct a risk assessment? Well, there are three good reasons. It enables you to identify assets. It's a critical issue, of course. What assets have we got? It enables you to identify threats to those assets and vulnerabilities that those threats might exploit. If you can identify a vulnerability that a threat can exploit, then you've got something to worry about. If you can identify a vulnerability for which there are no threats, why worry? If you can identify a threat, but there's no vulnerabilities, why worry? If somebody tells you that there is an identified threat to open source software and you don't deploy any open source software on your infrastructure, why worry about the threat to open source software? If you have a specific vulnerability in your software and there are no known threats that might exploit it, why worry about closing it down? Got to close it down, you might say, because sooner or later a threat might emerge. That's absolutely true. And that at least gives you two choices. One is to track the emergence of threats, and the other is to try and close it down. But if you don't know what threats might exploit the vulnerability, you're at risk of not closing down the vulnerability in a way that is appropriate. So you conduct a risk assessment in order to identify the assets that might be at risk and therefore the value that might be at risk, and to work out for each of those assets what vulnerabilities you have and what threats might exploit those vulnerabilities. The vulnerability is internal to an asset, the threat is usually external to an asset. So a threat assessment is the business of trying to work out what threats there are. A vulnerability assessment is trying to work out what vulnerabilities pertain to that specific asset. And the risk assessment carried out well is going to recognize threats about which you care, not just the ones about which you don't care, obviously, but the threats about which you care. It's going to enable you to think about preventing threats, both neutralizing threats as well as defending yourself against them. It enables you to look at how you can close down vulnerabilities so the threats can't exploit them. And it's an effective method of risk assessment of getting the whole of the information security team involved in thinking about how to manage risk. Even today, inside organizations, we find organizations with ISO 27001 certifications, we find new information security people saying there's a risk, we need to put a control in place. And they have to be re-educated to think about, is there actually a vulnerability for the threat to exploit? Is the risk one that management might be prepared to accept? Or is it a risk which actually management won't be prepared to accept and therefore it needs to be dealt with? So the fact that risk assessment enables management to set, if you like, parameters within which risks have to be addressed, it means the organization can reduce the cost of compliance because it's not complying with not applying the controls where it doesn't need them, but it can at the same time reduce the possibility of damages to the organization arising from reputation damage or regulatory damage or punitive damage or any one of those kinds of areas. So you can reduce the size of damage while also reducing costs, and that makes it, from a business point of view, a practical starting point to build out an ISMS. And the truth is that for ISO 27001, you can't build an information security management system without conducting a risk assessment. So how do you do it? The answer is it's a 5-step process. You start off by creating a framework within which you can assess risk. The second step is to identify the risks. The third is to analyze them. The fourth is to evaluate them. And the fifth, obviously, is to select and apply controls. What is your risk treatment option? Having worked out whether the risk is something that should be on your radar, you've got to determine what to do about it. So those are the 5 steps. Let's have a look at them in a little bit more detail. Start with a risk management framework. A risk management framework is a subset of your information security management system. So it's the set of documented policies and procedures which sets out a formal methodology for assessing risk. And the point about a formal methodology is that it should ensure that the results of the risk assessment are consistent, valid, and comparable. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you carry out a risk assessment in relation to your laptop estate today and you arrive at a conclusion about a particular threat and vulnerability and the level of risk the organization is applying, and you select a control, and somebody comes along in a week's time and carries out a risk assessment for the same laptop estate, they should arrive at exactly the same decision that you did. So it should be consistent. The application of the methodology should give a consistent result. It shouldn't depend on the information security manager's own subjective preference or previous experience. It should be sufficiently objective to drive a consistent assessment. It should be valid. In other words, management should recognize that the decisions which you arrive at about applying controls are decisions with which they're happy. They think they're appropriate in the context of management's approach to risk. You must all have seen circumstances in which a senior manager bemoans the fact that risk assessment or information security has made it impossible for them to do something which previously they would have done with ease. And the truth is that in most cases, an organization should still be able to do the things it needs to do and do them more securely. If a risk assessment is making it difficult or impossible for people to do things which are an essential part of the business operating, then the risk assessment is likely to be invalid. Comparable. Comparable means that if you carry out a risk assessment on a laptop estate and arrive at a set of decisions, and you then carry out a risk assessment on the server estate and arrive at a decision about that, the likely controls that you should put in place on the server estate should be comparable, taking into account the greater exposure and risk to those that you put in place for the laptop estate. So those are the key words: consistent, valid, and comparable. And you want your risk assessment methodology, as I said, to be documented, but to deliver those kinds of results. Any external assessor would be looking for evidence that the risk assessment does indeed work like that. So in creating a risk management framework, it should be top down, should start with the board, should start with talking to the board or the top management team about what their appetite for risk is. How much are we prepared to lose in comparison to what are we prepared to spend to avoid losing it? If something's going to cost us $1,000, but it'll cost us $2,000 to prevent it happening, do we want to spend the $2,000 or do we live with $1,000? What we find is most managements, when they start thinking about risk assessment and risk appetite, start off by saying we don't want to take any risk at all. And the reality is that don't want to take any risk at all, costs an inordinate amount of money. And as soon as you say we can do that, but it's going to cost $2.5 million as distinct from the $100,000 we're currently spending, you'll find management will quickly decide that actually it can cope with some risk. So that's the starting point. What is management's risk appetite? And once you've arrived at management's risk appetite, you can begin to think about the method of carrying out a risk assessment. If management's got a very sophisticated approach to risk, it wants to be able to judge risk in a number of different spheres and a number of different ways of cutting it, you might need quite a complex methodology. If management's got a pretty simple method which says, look, there are 5 levels of risk, for instance, or 3 levels of risk, 5 levels of risk, there's low to medium, 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 and medium to high, and high, for instance, that's our 5 levels of risk. You probably can get away with a simpler risk assessment methodology. So what's the risk appetite? Think then about the methodology. And there are a number of methodologies available. I'll talk about one over the course of the next few slides, but there are many other methodologies available, and you can, inside this 5-step approach, deploy any practical risk assessment methodology that suits you or that you're currently using elsewhere in the organization. All risks should be owned. No point in determining that there's a risk and then nobody takes accountability for applying the selected controls. So you need, if you're going to put a risk assessment or risk management framework in place, to embed the concept of risk ownership. And the owner of a risk should be clearly identified. They should be documented in the top management risk register. The risk should be owned by a given role inside the company. I would recommend that you identify it by role, not by named individual, because people leave and you don't want to have to rewrite your documentation. You want always the CISO to own particular types of risks, whoever happens to be wearing that hat at the time. So the concept of risk ownership is a critical one. Let me talk then about the idea of risk calculation. You can apply a numeric value to risk, and it comes out of thinking about risk as being the consequence of the fact that if a threat is going to exploit a vulnerability, there has to be a likelihood of that happening. And if it does happen, there has to be an impact on the organization or on the asset that is compromised. So if you start thinking backwards from the impact, of course, you notice that you could determine impact in terms of loss of time or loss of money. There's a number of different scales that you could use, and you could arrive, for instance, at a financial consequence that was minimal, say under $500, a financial consequence that was medium, say between $500 and $5,000, and a financial consequence that was high, which might be over $5,000. And obviously you can move that scale up by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100, or you could subdivide it further. But you could arrive at an impact scale measured in dollars or measured in compromise of the business. And then you can arrive at a likelihood scale. And typically likelihood should be based on evidence, not on suspicion or expectation. So if somebody says to you, the likelihood of somebody breaking into our offices at 5 o'clock in the morning when there is nobody else on site, there's only the first person in there, and they are alone, and somebody could recognize they're alone, break in, hold them hostage, steal all the equipment. You need to have some evidence that that has occurred somewhere, rather than just saying, yeah, that's a very likely scenario. It's not a likely scenario. The fact that you can imagine it, or you could read about it or write about it in a thriller, doesn't mean it's actually likely. You should be looking at hard evidence that indicates that these kinds of things do actually happen. And the combination of a numeric likelihood and a numeric impact can give you, if you multiply them out, can give you a risk factor, the calculation of risk. And that might look like this on a risk assessment scale. So ignoring for a moment whatever you might apply to the impact levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, in terms of frequency or evidence of the thing occurring, and on your vertical axis, the vertical axis is the likelihood of the thing occurring. On the horizontal axis is the impact measured however you choose it. The risk level is then going to be shown as the intersection on that graph. So very high likelihood and very high impact intersects at a risk level 9. That's your highest possible risk. You'd plot onto a risk assessment scale like that where management's risk appetite sits. And in this example, that's colored green. So risk levels 3 and under are risks that management is prepared to accept. So what this graph is showing you is that if you calculate out a particular given risk and management says, well, if the risk level is 3, we'll live with it, and you identify that a particular risk has a low likelihood and a medium impact, that you can see clearly falls into risk level 4, and that therefore is a risk that has to be addressed. It's not one that can be ignored as falling within management's risk appetite. So the benefit of risk assessment scale is it can make the identification of risk level something which you can carry out very quickly and easily. And so the what's called a qualitative risk assessment is, for this reason, a very practical way for an organization to go. Okay, so you've got a methodology. The next step is to think about what the actual issues are that you have to deal with. And that means you've got to think about really people, process, and technology. You'll remember that an ISMS is a specification for a management system which takes account of people, process, and technology. Well, you've got to be looking at risks in each of those areas. So you've got to be looking at things people might do, weaknesses in processes, and weaknesses in technology that might be exploited either deliberately or accidentally by an attacker or by a natural event. You've also got to identify information assets. That means you need to create an information asset register. And that means you'll need some rules for what you want to be on the information asset register. You want to determine whether you want everything on there. Do you need to include USB sticks and headphones? Do you include laptops? Do you include laptop bags? Do you include servers, projectors, screens? Do you include software? Do you include operating systems? Typically, information assets will be business processes. Those are primary assets, and data, that's a primary asset. There are a number of secondary assets, which you might also want to include: hardware, software, intellectual property. You might include intellectual property as part of your classification of data. However you do it, you need to create an information asset with rules about how you determine those things about which you care. And the clue to an information asset register, an asset is something that's valuable to the organization, is only include on it stuff that's valuable. Don't turn to the financial register, because the financial register writes things off and doesn't include many of your most valuable assets. The financial asset register typically doesn't include data. Data is probably your most valuable asset. So create an information asset register which identifies and attempts to value, again on a qualitative scale, those assets. And consider the value of those assets in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of each asset. There are some assets where the protection of confidentiality or integrity is less important than protecting its availability. So, for instance, a laptop that you need to be able to deliver a presentation to a client, the availability of that laptop and the data on it is probably much more important than the confidentiality and integrity of that data, because it's protected by boot encryption, and so nobody can get at it. But losing the laptop might make it impossible for you to do a critical presentation. So thinking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability of each asset is another step in determining how to assess the value of the asset. And it's really the role of the asset owner to identify the value to the organization of a given asset. Asset owners are typically scattered through an organization. There might be people in the technology or IT team. You might have a role in your infrastructure team, which owns all of the hardware. You might have another role in the applications team, which owns operating systems and applications, for instance. You might have business users who are perhaps guardians of laptops, which are owned by somebody in the infrastructure team. But those are all components of putting in place an effective asset ownership structure. I've talked already about risk owners. Risk owners could be the same as the asset owners, but are not necessarily so. Do bear in mind that hard copies of information are just as important as electronic files and mobile devices. So think about the assets. You're going to look at what the risks are, the threats and vulnerabilities are in the context of specific assets, because it's the compromise of those assets that you're going to need to worry about. So that was the second step. First step was create a risk management framework. Second step was to identify the assets that you have at risk. The third step is to analyze risks. As I said, a vulnerability is something native to the asset. For instance, it's unpatched software, or it's a inadequately taught or trained process. A threat is external to the asset, so that might be a hacker, it might be a act of nature. It's something which is going to be able to exploit the vulnerability. And what you're going to be looking for is how you can determine practical, cost-effective things to reduce the likelihood of the threat exploiting the vulnerabilities. You want to try and determine threats and vulnerabilities as exactly as you can. Many software vulnerabilities can be determined by reference to online databases where vulnerabilities will be numbered, and the likelihoods can be derived from that, and the appropriate control to put in place can also be identified. You're going to assign impact and likelihood criteria to each threat vulnerability combination, and that's going to be based on your predetermined criteria. So you're going to analyze risks. Every threat and vulnerability to an asset or in relation to an asset, you're going to analyze so that you can determine the risk to the asset. That means you can then evaluate them. You can plot all of your identified risks onto a risk assessment graph. And once you've got them all identified on a risk assessment graph, you can then determine what you need to do, what you need to tackle first. And if you visualize that graph from a couple of slides earlier, obviously you're going to want to deal with the risks in the top right corner first. Anything with a risk level of 9, you're going to want to address long before you address anything with a risk level of 3, 4, or 5. So your risk graph, your risk graph enables you to prioritize which risks you need to be addressed and the order in which you address them. It's also the basis on which you can determine how to treat risk. And in any risk management methodology, there are really only 4 fundamental approaches to treating risk, and they're typically called avoid, modify, share, or transfer. Avoiding a risk is exactly that. It means you don't do the thing that would trigger the risk. So you avoid a risk to threats to open source software by not deploying open source software on your systems. You've avoided it completely. You modify a risk by putting a control in place to reduce either the likelihood or the impact of the risk occurring. So you can reduce likelihood by patching a vulnerability. You can reduce impact by providing multiple easily accessible backups. You can share a risk, which you can do by some form of insurance, for instance. You can typically transfer a risk to a third party. This is not going to deal with the likelihood of occurring, but it will reduce the financial impact of the risk occurring. So sharing a risk is your third option, and your fourth option is to retain the risk. Retain the risk, you could think of that as ignoring the risk. It means we're going to do it and we'll live with the risk. Typically, organizations retain risks where the impact is very high, the cost of mitigating it is very high, and the likelihood is very low. So in the east of England, the likelihood of a typhoon is extremely low. The impact, if it were to occur, would be extremely high, and you would not therefore take any steps to build defenses against typhoons. If you thought there was any likelihood at all, you would probably insure against it. You typically insure against a whole range of acts of nature. If you were in the Caribbean, obviously the circumstances are somewhat different, so you would probably take not just insurance steps to share the risk, but you would take some steps to modify the risk by building underground shelters, perhaps for your servers. There'd be a number of things you could do to deal with the impact of a much more likely risk. So select risk treatment options. And once you've selected risk treatment options, you can then move into the final step, which is to select controls. And you select controls really only on the basis of those risks which you've decided to modify. Remember, if you're retaining the risk, you're doing nothing about it. If you're sharing it, you're transferring the risk to a third party, typically through insurance. If you're accepting the risk, then you are living with the risk and its consequences. So your controls are available in a number of places. Annex A of ISO 27001, PCI DSS, which is the payment card industry's data security standard, in NIST series of special publications. They have several sets of appropriate controls. The 20 critical cybersecurity controls, which have been developed for the critical national infrastructure, is used both in the United States and in the UK as a core set of controls for critical national infrastructure, for CNI. And then there's the cloud controls matrix, which is another set of controls developed very specifically for entities operating in the cloud. So each of them, from an ISO 27001 point of view, is a perfectly acceptable set of controls. You can choose what's appropriate for your organization. If you're processing payment cards, PCI DSS is likely to be a good starting point. If you're providing services to federal government, then the NIST SP 800 series is likely to be a good starting point. Critical national infrastructure, the 20 critical controls. If you're in the cloud, obviously the cloud controls matrix, but many organizations find that Annex A to ISO 27001, the list of 114 controls set out there, tends to be very effective. It's got guidance in ISO 27002 that talks through how you can apply those controls. It's a very effective control set. And just briefly to touch on the 114 controls, there are 14 control sets, 114 controls. The standard is written so you can apply those controls outside of the context of ISO 27002. In other words, you can just select and apply them without even applying a risk assessment. That won't get you an ISO 27001 certificate, but it'll give you guidance on applying those controls. A5 is about information security policy, sets guidance for an organization on how it's tackling information security. A6 is the organization of information security, and typically this deals with the structure with which the organization approaches information security, how it organizes both internally and externally to have appropriate response mechanisms, identifies user groups that it can deal with that. All of that's part of organizing information security. A7 looks at HR, at human resources, and that's primarily about information security before, during, and after employment. So making sure that you check somebody out, doing security checks before employment, training people properly while they're employed by you, making sure that when they leave, you close off access to all of their systems. A8 picks up on asset management. So it's very much dealing with the second step in the 5-step risk assessment. And it's a set of controls around identifying and dealing with all of the assets that an organization may have to be responsible for. A9 deals with access control. Access control is, of course, at the heart of ensuring that you protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. And this is about access on a business need-to-know basis. It's about access at a number of different levels, recognizing that network access shouldn't necessarily give you access rights to data at a data level. Recognizing that individual usernames should be unique, that passwords should be unique to individual users. All of that is about effective access control. Cryptography is really got two controls. One's about the application of cryptography, having a cryptography policy, and the other's about managing crypto keys. Both are important. Encrypting data in flight and at risk is a fundamental step in minimizing risks to data subjects. Under EU GDPR, it's likely to mean that you don't have to report a data breach to the regulator, and having an understanding of crypto keys is also important. There are many countries into which, when you go, you may have to provide the cryptographic key so that somebody can access your data and see that there's nothing illegal on your laptop. So how you manage those is an important part of effective data security. A11 deals with physical and environmental security. It deals with location of assets. It deals with protecting against environmental threats, cabling, the whole range of things that, if access, can create dangers for organizations. A12 then looks at operational security. It starts obviously with roles and responsibilities, with documented operating procedures, but it looks at all of the different aspects of how an IT operations team should look after and manage its IT securely. A13 looks at comms. It looks at internet connections, communication networks, interconnectivity on networks. It deals with that whole range of items. It will include areas like bring your own device. They all get touched on in A13. A14 is the concept that you should ensure that when you're acquiring systems, you determine the information security necessities before selecting systems rather than afterwards. So system acquisition, development, maintenance should have information security built into it from the outset. A15 is about supplier relationships and the extension of cybersecurity to the supply chain, recognizing the brutal reality that many of today's threats come into the organization through vulnerabilities in the supply chain, and therefore being able to assess risk and apply appropriate controls, starting with policy, but driving that all the way through the ICT supply chain is an important part of a maturing organizational information security management system. Managing incidents is the recognition that you're going to be breached. I think I saw a datum today that says the average SMB is breached 44 times a day. If you don't have an effective mechanism for identifying information security incidents and responding to breaches, one or more of those is going to be effective, not necessarily in destroying your organization, but in losing you chunks of time. And every hour that is lost is an hour of productivity that's lost. If you could have dealt with that through a more effective information security incident reporting and response process, then it would have been worthwhile doing. Recognizing that increasingly information security has to tie into a business continuity framework for an organization to be cyber resilient. A17 talks about how information security ties into business continuity, and it also looks at how you protect business continuity management systems and business continuity management plans. Finally, A18 ties all of your information security controls to the various compliance obligations that you have. Obviously, information security incident management would tie in the United States to data breach reporting at a state level. In New York, it would tie into the data security requirements. The GDPR has incident reporting requirements. A18 is the control which looks at how you can pull together all of those compliance requirements into a mechanism which ensures your controls serve multiple compliance requirements simultaneously. So those are the 14 control sets, 114 controls spread across GDPR. How do you build those controls into your management system? The answer is they get put into a risk treatment plan. A risk treatment plan is a mandatory document for ISO 27001. It's the document which lists all of the controls you've selected by comparison to those contained in Annex A of ISO 27001. That's the statement of applicability. The statement of applicability lists all of the controls by comparison to ISO 27001, and the risk treatment plan identifies how you've applied those selected controls. So it identifies which role is responsible for applying the control, the owner of the control, if you like, the time scale within which the control is to be put in place, and should link to the measures that you're going to use to monitor the effectiveness of that control. So selected controls, so you, if you go back to the point in your risk assessment where you've decided to modify a risk by selecting a control. That control will be shown up in a statement of applicability. The statement of applicability links to a risk treatment plan, which sets out how the control is applied, and the risk treatment plan drives your ongoing review and improvement activity, which is designed to work out whether the selected control was indeed appropriate, whether you need to review your risk assessment. If it is appropriate, is it working as intended? Is it achieving the information security objectives that you set for your management system originally? And the continual review, updates, and improvement activity should enable you to adjust your control framework to suit your changing threat environment. And of course, the threat environment does change, not least because your organization can change, but because new threats and vulnerabilities are continually emerging. And you need, therefore, to be monitoring both on an annual global basis, but also on an ongoing asset level and environment level, the emergence of new threats, the possibility that you've got new vulnerabilities. And you need to be updating your controls in the light of those. And bearing in mind, the controls are not just software controls, they are staff awareness controls, they're appropriate documents, processes, and procedures. And you need to be continually looking at how you update those to ensure that your management system is suitable for the objectives you're trying to achieve. IT governance is a one-stop shop, as I said at the beginning of this webinar. You can get a copy of ISO 27001, the standard. You can get a copy of related standards, 27002 and others. There's a lot of free guidance available on the website. There are ISO 27001 training courses, both foundation and implementer level, which you can do both online and in classroom in the Northeast of the United States. There is a policy and documentation toolkit with pre-populated documents which you can adapt and amend to suit your purposes, but which can save very substantial amounts of time in terms of your deployment of a management system, because, hey, they're a widely used set of effective documents. You can get us to carry out a gap analysis, which we can do on-site or remotely against the requirements of ISO 27001. And many organizations, in thinking about ISO 27001 as a way to address multiple compliance requirements, will kick off their project with a gap analysis. Of course, there is risk assessment software. The whole of the risk assessment methodology that I've been talking about can be automated. There is a tool called VS Risk, which again, we sell through our website. We're a reseller for VS Risk, which is a subsidiary of our parent company. And it's a tool which automates the whole of risk assessment to make the business of giving reproducible, comparable, consistent, valid results a very straightforward exercise. And we have packages. As you see in the bottom bar, there are packages of products and services that you can buy on our website that will make it much simpler for organizations addressing ISO 27001. And you don't have to buy on the website, though of course you can. You can also go onto our you can can go onto VS Risk. You can have a look at the VS Risk tool on our website. You can have a look at the training courses on our website. There's an offer on right now if you take the Foundation and Lead Implementer as a combined course. And you can just simply visit our website to access all of the information. You can email us for data about particular products and services. You can call us toll-free on that number. You can follow us through any one of the various social medias. So that brings us to the end, ladies and gentlemen, of what I was planning to say this evening. So there's a bit of time left over where we can deal with questions if you have any. If you've got questions that you haven't asked on the GoToWebinar panel, there is a Q&A box. You can type questions into the Q&A box, and I'll pick out any questions that you've got and I'll answer them. And the first question here is what is the validity of an ISO 27001 certification? And the answer to that is an ISO 27001 certification, which is typically carried out by an independent certification body such as DNV or NQA or BSI. They're all have major operations in the United States. They will do certifications or registrations for ISO 9001 and other standards, and their certification will enable you to demonstrate, if you have to stakeholders, to customers, to district attorneys, that actually you've done the best that you could do to put in place an appropriate information security framework. It's not just you saying that you did what you could have done. You've had an independent expert come along, carry out an audit against ISO 27001 and provide a certificate of compliance saying that you did the thing exactly as you should have done. Yes to the next question. The slides will be sent out to everybody who's registered on this webinar. You'll be able to access them within the next 3 or 4 days. The training, yes, the question is the practitioner training, does it include some training on how to carry out a risk assessment? Yes, this 5-step risk assessment methodology is included in the practitioner course, which is a 3-day course that takes you through how to implement an information security management system from project mandate, getting management buy-in, all the way through to the point at which you've successfully completed an independent audit and are preparing for the ongoing continual audits that happen thereafter. And unless there are any more questions, approximately how much does risk assessment cost? Well, this risk assessment you can carry out for yourself. So if you're competent to do the risk assessment, it doesn't cost you anything other than your own time, and the time you put in will be determined by the number of assets that you have and the range of risks that you've got to assess. The risk assessment tool itself, I think, is something in the order of I think it's around about less than $1,000 a year as a subscription price to the risk assessment tool. And there's obviously a software support package to that, but that tool can then be used on an ongoing basis to manage risks. So there you are, there's 2 answers to the question about risk assessment. If you go to the site link that I showed you a short while ago, you'll be able to read more about VS Risk and see exactly what the price for the risk assessment tool is. But as I said, you can carry out a risk assessment yourself at no cost. You can, of course, hire a company like us to come. We can use a risk assessment tool and we can do the risk assessment for you, and then that's going to be based on the number of days that it takes to do the risk assessment. So pretty well any way that works for your organization is possible. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that probably brings us to the end. It doesn't look like I have any more questions here to answer, so I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope that this has been useful. There are going to be other webinars on ISO 27001 on compliance for our customers in the United States. Please do track those on our website and do feel free to join us for other webinars. I'd like to thank you for being here today and wish you have a very good day. Bye-bye.